Welcome back to Finding Normal. I want to read you guys a story today. It's called a freedom test. It's to determine how free we are or how free we think we might be, and maybe how free we once were and how we are not free now. So, here we go. Some years ago, about 1900, an old trapper from North Dakota hitched up some horses to his wagon, packed a few possessions, especially his traps, and drove south. Several weeks later, he stopped in a small town just north of the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. It was a Saturday morning, a lazy day, when he walked into the general store. Sitting around the pot-bellied stove were 7 or 8 of the town's local citizens. The traveler spoke. "Gentlemen, could you direct me to the Okefenokee Swamp?" Some of the old-timers looked at him like he was crazy. "You must be a stranger in these parts," they said. "I am. I'm from North Dakota," said the stranger. "In the Okefenokee Swamp are thousands of wild hogs," one man exclaimed. "A man who goes into this swamp by himself asks to die." He lifted up his leg. "I lost half my leg here to the pigs of that swamp." Another old fellow, "Look at the cuts on me. Look at my arm bit off. Those pigs have been free since the Revolution, eating snakes and rooting out roots and fending for themselves for over 100 years. They're wild and they are dangerous. You can't trap them. No man dare go into the swamp by himself." Every man nodded his head in agreement. The old trapper said, "Thank you so much for the warning. Now, could you direct me to the swamp?" They said, "Well, yeah, it's due south, straight down that road." But they begged the stranger not to go because they knew that he'd meet a terrible fate. He said, "Sell me 10 sacks of corn and help me load it into the wagon." And they did. Then the old trapper bid them farewell and drove on down the road. The townsfolk thought they'd never see him again. 2 weeks later, the man came back. He pulled up to the general store, got down off the wagon, walked in and bought 10 more sacks of corn. After loading it up, he went back down the road toward the swamp. 2 weeks later, he returned and again bought 10 sacks of corn. This went on for about 3 months. Every week or two, the old trapper would come into town on a Saturday morning, load up 10 sacks of corn, and drive off south into the swamp. The stranger soon became a legend in the little village and the subject of much speculation. People wondered, what had possessed this man that he could go into the swamp by himself and not be consumed by the wild and free hogs? One morning, the man came into town as usual. Everyone thought he wanted more corn. He got off the wagon and went into the store, where the usual group of men were gathered around the stove. He took off his gloves. "Gentlemen," he said, "I need to hire about 10 or 15 wagons. I need 20 or 30 men. I have 6,000 hogs out in the swamp penned up and they're all hungry. I've got to get them to market right away." "You've what in the swamp?" asked the storekeeper. "I have 6,000 hogs penned up. They haven't eaten for 2 or 3 days, and they'll starve if I don't get them back there to feed them and take care of them." One of the old-timers said, "You mean you've captured the wild hogs of the Okefenokee Swamp?" "That's right." "How did you do that? And what did you do?" the men urged breathlessly. One of them exclaimed, "But I lost my arm." "I lost my brother," cried another. "I lost my leg to those wild boars," chimed a third. The trapper said, "Well, the first week I went in there, they were wild all right. They hid in the undergrowth and wouldn't come out. I dared not get off the wagon. So I spread corn along behind the wagon. Every day I'd spread a sack of corn. The old pigs would have nothing to do with it, but the younger pigs decided that it was easier to eat free corn than it was to root out roots and catch snakes. So the very young began to eat the corn first. I did this every day. Pretty soon, even the old pigs decided that it was easier to eat free corn. After all, they were all free. They were not penned up. They could run off in any direction at any time. The next thing was to get them used to eating in the same place all the time. So I selected a clearing, and I started putting the corn in the clearing. At first, they wouldn't come to the clearing. It was too far, it was too open, and it was a nuisance to them. But the very young decided that it was easier to take the corn in the clearing than it was to root out roots and catch their own snakes. And not long thereafter, the older pigs also decided that it was easier to come to the clearing every day. And so the pigs learned to come to the clearing every day to get their free corn. They could still subsidize their diet with roots and snakes and whatever else they wanted. After all, they were all free. They could run in any direction at any time. There were no bounds upon them. The next step was to get them used to fence posts. So I put up fence posts all around the clearing. I put them in the underbrush so that they wouldn't get suspicious or upset. After all, they were just sticks sticking up out of the ground like the trees and the brush. The corn was there every day. It was easy to walk in between the posts and get the corn and walk back out. This went on for a week or two, and shortly they became very used to walking into the clearing, getting the free corn, and walking back out through the fence posts. The next step was to put up one rail down at the bottom. I also left a few openings so that the older, fatter pigs could walk through the openings and the younger pigs could easily jump over just one rail. After all, it was no real threat to their freedom or independence. They could always jump over the rail and flee in any direction at any time. Now I decided that I wouldn't feed them every day. I began to feed them every other day. On the days I didn't feed the pigs, they still gathered in the clearing. They squealed and they grunted, and they begged and pleaded with me to feed them. But I only fed them every other day, and I put a second rail around the posts. Now the pigs became more and more desperate for food, because now they were no longer used to going out and digging their own roots and finding their own food. They now needed me. They needed my corn every other day. So I trained them that I would feed them every day if they came in through a gate. And I put up a third rail around the fence. But it was still no great threat to their freedom because there were several gates and they could run in and out at will. Finally, I put up the fourth rail. Then I closed the gates but one, and I fed them very, very well. Yesterday, I closed the last gate, and today, I need you to help me take these pigs to market. So, I hope you enjoyed the story. It was originally written to emphasize the absurdity of the modern financial system and the idea of so-called free money. However, it perfectly illustrates how the modern industrial society has created slaves of a once free people. I hope this story helps others to understand that as Americans, where we once came from and where we are headed as a nation, if we don't make changes. Okay, that's it for now. Hit the like button if you get anything from these videos, and remember, a simple life is a beautiful life.